The smack echoed like a gunshot over the diner's clinking coffee cups. 72-year-old Martha stumbled backward, clutching her suddenly bruising cheek. Sheriff Cobb wiped spilled coffee from his pristine uniform. His lip curled in disgust as he towered over her, barking an insult that froze the room in terror. He thought she was just a helpless old woman in a town he absolutely owned. He had no idea her only son had just returned from a classified deployment, and he was a Navy SEAL. The morning sun baked the asphalt outside Patsy's Diner in Pine Ridge, Alabama, baking the small town in a familiar, suffocating heat. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sizzling bacon, burnt filter coffee, and the low, easy murmur of locals gossiping over eggs. Tuesday mornings were always the same, anchored by the presence of Martha Higgins. Martha was 72, a retired high school English teacher who had spent 40 years pouring her heart into the town's youth. She was a woman of deep faith and quiet dignity, with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, and hands that, while twisted slightly with arthritis, were always quick to offer a comforting pat on a neighbor's shoulder. She sat in her usual booth near the back, nursing a cup of decaf and reading a paperback novel. Half the people in the diner had learned how to read proper sentences in her classroom. They knew her, respected her, and loved her. But Pine Ridge was a town with a deep, dark underbelly, and that underbelly wore a badge. The bell above the glass door chimed violently, and the easy hum of the diner instantly died. Sheriff Clayton Cobb strode in. Cobb was a massive man, standing 6'4" with a barrel chest and a face permanently flushed with arrogance. He was a third-generation sheriff, a man who treated Pine Ridge not as a jurisdiction to protect, but as a personal fiefdom to rule. His reputation for brutality, especially toward the town's black residents, was an open secret that the local government was too terrified or too complicit to address. Cobb didn't wait in lines. He didn't ask nicely. He walked straight to the counter, expecting the world to part for him. Martha, struggling slightly with her stiff knees, had just stood up from her booth to grab a fresh packet of sugar from the central station. Her vision wasn't what it used to be, and her right leg dragged just a fraction. As she turned, she didn't see the sheriff barreling down the narrow aisle. Her shoulder clipped Cobb's massive arm. The collision was minor, but it was enough to make Cobb jerk backward. The lukewarm coffee in his heavy ceramic mug sloshed over the rim, spilling a few brown drops onto the crisp, tan fabric of his uniform shirt. For a second, the diner went so quiet you could hear the grease popping on the grill in the back. "Oh, Lord," Martha gasped, immediately pulling a napkin from the dispenser. "Sheriff Cobb, I am so incredibly sorry. Let me help you with that. My eyes just didn't catch you." Cobb looked down at the stain, then up at Martha. His eyes were cold, flat, and devoid of any human empathy. He didn't see a retired teacher. He saw a target he could demean to remind the room who was in charge. "Get your filthy hands away from me," Cobb snarled, his voice a low, gravelly threat that carried to every corner of the room. Martha froze, her hand trembling in the air holding the white paper napkin. Sheriff, it was an accident. I said, Cobb interrupted, taking a step forward so his boots scuffed the linoleum. "Keep your hands off my uniform. You people think you can just wander around, bumping into folks, disrespecting the law. You think because you've been here a long time, you forget your place. I'm sick of looking at you." Patsy, the diner's owner, stepped out from behind the counter, her face pale. "Sheriff, please, it's just Martha. She's got bad joints. Let me get you a towel and your meal is on the house." "Shut up, Patsy," Cobb snapped without looking at her. He leaned down, getting his face inches from Martha's. "You know how much this uniform costs, old woman. You know what it represents? It represents the line between order and the garbage that ruins this country. "Sheriff," Martha said, her voice shaking but her chin lifting with that old teacher's pride. She had dealt with bullies before. "There is no need to speak to me that way. It was a mistake. Now, excuse me." She tried to step around him to return to her booth. That was her mistake. In Cobb's twisted mind, walking away was an act of defiance. It was a challenge to his absolute authority. Without a second thought, Cobb raised his massive, heavy-ringed hand and struck her. The slap was vicious. The sheer force of the blow lifted Martha off her feet. She crashed hard against the edge of a formica table before crumbling to the checkered floor, knocking over a tray of empty glasses that shattered around her. Gasps and muffled screams erupted from the patrons. Two men at the counter halfway stood up, their fists clenched, but Cobb instantly dropped his hand to the butt of his service weapon. "Anybody got something to say?" Cobb roared, glaring at the paralyzed room. The men slowly sat back down, their eyes dropping to their plates in deep, agonizing shame. Nobody moved. The fear Cobb commanded was total. Cobb looked down at Martha. She was on the floor, holding her cheek, blood beginning to pool in the corner of her mouth, where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. Her glasses were broken on the floor next to her. "Clean up this mess," Cobb said to Patsy, adjusting his gun belt. "And tell this old bat that if I see her in town again this week, I'll arrest her for assaulting an officer." With that, the sheriff turned and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming a cheerful, mocking sound as the door swung shut. On the floor, Martha didn't cry. She slowly gathered her broken glasses, her hands shaking violently as the crushing weight of humiliation and helplessness settled over her. She had never felt so entirely alone. Martha didn't go to the hospital. She wouldn't let Patsy call an ambulance, and she certainly wouldn't let anyone call the state police. She knew how Pine Ridge worked. Calling the authorities on Sheriff Cobb was like calling a wolf to complain about a bite. She walked the 6 blocks back to her small, single-story house on Elm Street, locked the deadbolt, and finally let the tears fall. By the time evening rolled around, the entire left side of her face was a swollen canvas of dark purple and angry blue. Her jaw throbbed with a relentless, sick agony, and her ribs ached from where she had hit the table. She sat in her rocking chair by the front window, clutching an ice pack wrapped in a dish towel, staring out at the fading light. She felt broken. The town she had loved, the people she had taught, had watched her get struck down and done nothing. The silence of her neighbors hurt almost as much as the physical blow. What Martha didn't know was that a black, unmarked SUV was currently turning off the interstate, 30 miles outside of Pine Ridge. Behind the wheel sat Senior Chief Petty Officer David Higgins. David was 34 years old, but his eyes looked much older. He was a man carved from granite and hardened in the most unforgiving corners of the globe. As an operator in the United States Navy's Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, David had spent the last decade hunting down high-value targets in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Syria, and the humid expanses of the Horn of Africa. He was a decorated warrior, bearing a silver star for pulling 3 wounded teammates from a burning Black Hawk under heavy fire, and a Purple Heart that left a jagged scar across his left shoulder. He hadn't told his mother he was coming home. His deployment had ended a month earlier than expected, and he wanted to surprise her. It had been nearly 2 years since he had sat on her porch and drank her sweet tea. As he drove through the winding country roads, a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. He was looking forward to peace. He was looking forward to the quiet. He pulled the SUV into Martha's gravel driveway, just as the sun dipped completely below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and dark blue. He grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat, walked up the wooden steps, and unlocked the front door with his old brass key. "Mum!" David called out, stepping into the hallway. The house was dark, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. "It's me." Surprise. He heard a sharp intake of breath from the living room. He walked in and flipped the light switch. Martha was sitting in her chair, the ice pack lowered to her lap. She quickly turned her head away, trying to hide her face in the shadows. But David had spent his entire adult life scanning environments for the smallest anomalies. His eyes locked onto her instantly. The smile vanished from his face. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He dropped his duffel bag. It hit the floor with a heavy, dead thud. He crossed the room in 3 massive, silent strides, kneeling in front of her. "David," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Baby, you're home early." "Mum, look at me," David said. His voice was incredibly calm. It wasn't the frantic panic of a worried son. It was the terrifying, icy composure of a professional who had just recognized a threat. Martha slowly turned her head. When David saw the full extent of the bruising, the swollen eye, the split lip, the dark, finger-shaped marks near her jawline, something shifted behind his eyes. The dutiful, loving son retreated, and the Tier 1 operator stepped forward. "Who did this?" he asked softly. "It was an accident, David. I fell. I tripped at the diner and hit the table." She tried to force a smile, but it made her wince in pain. She knew her son. She knew what he was capable of, and she was terrified of what would happen if he unleashed the war he carried inside him on this small town. David reached out, his calloused thumbs gently tracing the air just millimeters above the bruise. "Mum," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "I've spent 12 years analyzing blunt force trauma. A fall hits the zygomatic arch and the brow ridge. This is a strike pattern. 4 fingers and a thumb. Somebody slapped you hard enough to cause microfractures in the orbital floor." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and you are going to tell me the truth. Who put their hands on you?" Martha burst into tears. The walls she had built up all day crumbled under the intense, protective weight of her son's gaze. She leaned forward, burying her face in his broad shoulder, and cried out the shame and the fear. Between sobs, she told him everything. She told him about the coffee. She told him about the racial slurs. She told him about Sheriff Clayton Cobb and how nobody in the diner dared to breathe, let alone intervene. David held her, stroking her silver hair, letting her pour out her pain. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shout. He didn't punch a wall or scream for vengeance. He just listened, cataloguing every detail, building a psychological profile of his target. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes with a tissue, she looked at him pleadingly. "David, please, you can't do anything. Cobb runs the police, the judges, the mayor. He's been looking for an excuse to hurt people. If you go after him, he'll lock you up, or worse. Just let it go. I'm okay. I'm alive." David stood up slowly. He kissed her gently on the forehead. "You're right, Mom. We'll handle it legally. I'm going to go to the pharmacy to get you some proper painkillers. Lock the door behind me." Martha sighed in relief, believing she had talked him down. "Okay, honey. I love you." "I love you too," David said. David walked out to his SUV. He didn't start the engine immediately. He sat in the darkness, gripping the steering wheel. His heart rate, which rested at 40 beats per minute, hadn't elevated. His breathing was steady. He closed his eyes and initiated his mental OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. A small-town sheriff had assaulted his mother. A corrupt badge was terrorizing civilians. The local system was compromised. David opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth. Sheriff Cobb had just picked a fight with a ghost who brought the hell of the modern battlefield wherever he went. David put the truck in gear. He wasn't going to the pharmacy. He was going to gather intel. It was 9 p.m. when David parked his SUV 2 blocks away from Patsy's diner. The diner was closed, the neon open sign dark, but David could see a single fluorescent light glowing in the back office. Patsy was cashing out the registers. David moved through the shadows of the alleyway with the absolute silence of a man who had stalked heavily armed insurgents through pitch-black ravines. He didn't walk up to the front door. He approached the back delivery entrance, tested the handle, unlocked, and slipped inside the kitchen. Patsy was sitting at her small desk, counting stacks of worn bills, rubbing her temples. She looked exhausted. "You need to fix the lock on that back door, Miss Patsy," a voice said from the doorway. Patsy jumped, knocking a stack of tens onto the floor, a scream dying in her throat as she looked up. When she saw the tall, broad-shouldered man leaning against the doorframe, her panic shifted into a deep, sinking dread. She recognized him instantly, even though he was 15 years older and heavily muscled compared to the high school track star she remembered. "David," Patsy breathed, her face turning grey. "Oh, sweet Jesus. David Higgins." "Hello, Patsy," David said, stepping into the light. He was wearing dark jeans, boots, and a fitted black t-shirt that revealed the intricate military tattoos sleeving his right arm. "I saw my mother an hour ago." Patsy immediately burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "David, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I wanted to help her. I did. But Cobb, he had his hand on his gun. He's a monster, David. He destroys anyone who steps out of line in this town." David walked over and picked up the dropped money, setting it neatly on her desk. "I'm not here to yell at you, Patsy. I understand fear. I know what an armed man can do to unarmed civilians. But I need you to understand something. I am going to end Clayton Cobb's career, and I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I need intel." Patsy looked up, her eyes wide. "David, you're a soldier, I know that. But this isn't a war zone. This is Pine Ridge. Cobb has 20 deputies. He has the state politicians in his pocket. If you just go beat him up, they'll throw you in federal prison for assaulting an officer." "I'm not going to just beat him up," David said, his voice chillingly flat. "I'm going to dismantle his life. I'm going to tear down his empire brick by brick, so that by the time I'm finished with him, he'll be begging me to let him go to prison. But I need to know his pressure points. What else is he doing besides terrorizing old women?" Patsy hesitated, wringing her hands. Then she stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet, locking the office door first. "Nobody talks about it because the people he targets don't have the money for lawyers," Patsy whispered. "But Cobb isn't just a racist bully. He's running a racket. Over the last 2 years, he's been using civil asset forfeiture laws to steal property." David frowned. "Explain." "He targets the minority neighborhoods," Patsy said, pulling a folded county map from a drawer. "He'll pull someone over for a broken taillight, claim he smells marijuana, and seize their car. He'll raid a house claiming anonymous tips about drug activity, find nothing, but seize their cash and put a lien on the property under suspicion of criminal enterprise. He auctions the houses off for pennies on the dollar. And guess who buys them? A shell company connected to him," David guessed, his mind rapidly processing the tactical landscape. "Exactly," Patsy nodded. "A development group out of Atlanta. They want to bulldoze the east side of Pine Ridge to build a luxury logistics hub for the new highway. Your mother's house. David, your mother's house is right in the center of the proposed map." The pieces clicked together in David's mind with lethal precision. The slap in the diner wasn't just a spontaneous act of bigoted rage. It was a calculated act of terror. Cobb was trying to intimidate Martha into leaving town so he could seize her property. He was breaking her spirit to steal her home. "Does he have a weak link?" David asked. "Someone on the inside who isn't entirely loyal?" Patsy thought for a moment. "Deputy Toby Henderson. He's 23. His dad was a good cop, died a few years ago. Toby joined up to honor him. But I see the way he looks when Cobb goes off. He's sick to his stomach, but he's trapped. He usually works the graveyard shift alone, patrolling the county line." David nodded slowly. He had his entry point. He had his target's motive. And he had a potential human intelligence source. "Thank you, Patsy," David said, turning toward the back door. "David! Wait!" Patsy called out, her voice trembling. "What are you going to do?" David paused, looking back over his shoulder. The dim light caught the edge of the scar on his neck. "I'm going to conduct a psychological operation," David said softly. "I'm going to make Sheriff Cobb realize that he is no longer the apex predator in this town. Tell no one I was here." David slipped out into the alleyway, fading into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. By 2 a.m., David had tracked Deputy Toby Henderson's patrol car to a lonely stretch of highway near the county border. The cruiser was parked behind an abandoned billboard, engine idling, Toby likely trying to stay awake through a quiet night. David parked his SUV half a mile away in a thick grove of trees. He dressed in his tactical gear, dark clothing, soft-soled boots, a black ball cap, and a chest rig that he kept concealed under a light jacket. He didn't bring a firearm. He didn't need one to terrify a rookie cop. He brought zip ties, a flashlight, and his unyielding discipline. Moving through the dense Alabama brush, David was a ghost. He utilized the stealth techniques he had perfected stalking sentries in the Corangal Valley. He approached the cruiser from the rear blind spot, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs. Toby was inside, sipping an energy drink, listening to a sports podcast. The windows were rolled up, the air conditioning blasting. David reached the driver's side door. He waited for a passing semi-truck on the distant highway to mask the sound. As the rumble of the truck peaked, David struck the driver's side window with the base of his palm, hard enough to sound like a gunshot, but not hard enough to break the glass. Toby jumped out of his skin, dropping his energy drink all over his lap. He scrambled for his flashlight and his radio, peering into the pitch-black woods. He saw nothing. Trembling, Toby unlocked his door and stepped out, unholstering his service weapon. "Police, show yourself!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He swept his flashlight beam across the tree line. Nothing but shadows and Spanish moss. "I said show yourself!" Toby yelled, taking 3 steps away from the safety of his vehicle. It was a fatal tactical error. From the roof of the cruiser, where he had silently vaulted seconds before, David dropped down directly behind the deputy. Before Toby could even register the movement in his peripheral vision, David clamped a hand over his mouth, hooked a leg behind Toby's knee, and brought the young officer crashing to the dirt. In a span of 2 seconds, Toby found himself pinned face down in the mud, his gun expertly stripped from his hand, and a knee pressing into his spine with the weight of a falling anvil. "Do not scream. Do not struggle," a voice whispered directly into Toby's ear. The voice was so calm, so devoid of adrenaline, that it terrified Toby more than if the man had been screaming. "If you try to alert dispatch, I will dislocate your shoulder." "Nod if you understand." Toby, suffocating under the iron grip, nodded frantically. David slowly removed his hand from Toby's mouth, but kept the pressure on his spine. "My name is David Higgins. Martha Higgins is my mother." Toby went entirely rigid. He had heard the rumors at the station about what Cobb had done at the diner. He also knew, unlike Cobb, who Martha's son was. He had seen the framed military photos in Martha's hallway, when he responded to a noise complaint years ago. "Oh, God," Toby gasped into the dirt. "Man, please, I wasn't there. I swear to God I wasn't there." "I know you weren't," David said softly. "If you were, and you did nothing, we would be having a very different conversation. I am here because I need a tour guide, Toby. Sheriff Cobb has built a very dirty house, and you are going to give me the blueprints." "He'll kill me," Toby sobbed. "If I rat on him, he'll kill me." David leaned in closer, the icy calm never wavering. "Deputy, you need to recalibrate your threat assessment. Clayton Cobb is a local bully with a badge. I am a Tier 1 operator who has dismantled terrorist cells for the United States government. If you don't help me, I won't kill you. But I will make sure you go to federal prison for complicity in his racketeering. Now, you are going to tell me exactly where Cobb keeps the physical ledgers for his asset forfeiture properties. And then we are going to go for a drive." Toby's hands shook so violently he could barely keep his patrol cruiser on the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, David was a statue carved from midnight, his eyes scanning the passing pine trees with mechanical precision. "The lodge," Toby stammered, his voice dry. "It's about 10 miles out, off Route 9. Cobb bought it 3 years ago. Supposedly it's just a hunting cabin, but he's got a 10-foot high tensile fence around it and commercial-grade security cameras. He keeps 2 deputies posted there off the books every night. Carter and Walsh, they're his heavy hitters." "Lethal force authorized?" David asked, his tone strictly professional. "They carry AR-15S, and they've got orders to shoot trespassers on sight," Toby gulped. "Cobb claims it's to protect county evidence he stores there, but everyone knows it's his private vault. The ledgers, the offshore bank routing numbers, the property deeds. If it's not at the courthouse, it's in the floor safe in his master study." "Good," David said. "Pull over a mile before the gate. Keep your headlights off. You're going to wait in the car. If I am not back in 45 minutes, drive back to the station and pretend tonight never happened." "What are you going to do?" Toby asked, bringing the cruiser to a halt on the dirt shoulder. "I'm going to acquire the target package," David replied, slipping out of the door before Toby could even blink. The door clicked shut, and when Toby looked into the rearview mirror, the road was completely empty. It was as if the earth had swallowed the man whole. A mile down the road, the hunting lodge sat bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of halogens. It was a massive log and stone structure, completely out of place in the impoverished county. 2 men in tactical vests over their deputy uniforms were sitting on the expansive front porch, smoking cigars and playing cards on a folding table. Their rifles leaned against the railing. From the tree line, David observed them through a pair of compact thermal monoculars. He noted their casual posture, the loose slings on their rifles, and their complete lack of situational awareness. They were bullies used to intimidating unarmed civilians, not sentries expecting an assault from a Tier 1 operator. David bypassed the gate entirely. He scaled a large oak tree whose branches extended over the high tensile fence, moving with a fluid, silent grace that defied his size. He dropped onto the soft moss inside the perimeter, rolling to absorb the impact. He didn't want a firefight. Gunfire would draw the state police, and David needed a clean, airtight case for the FBI, not a local shootout that Cobb could spin as a drug raid gone wrong. He flanked the house, moving through the shadows until he reached the breaker box on the side of the garage. With a multi-tool, he popped the lock and studied the panel. He didn't cut the main power. That would trigger the backup generators and put the guards on high alert. Instead, he isolated the circuit for the exterior porch lights and the front-facing cameras. He flipped the switch. On the porch, the halogens died instantly, plunging Carter and Walsh into darkness. "What the hell?" Carter muttered, the scrape of his chair echoing loudly in the quiet night. "Break a trip again?" "Probably," Walsh sighed, picking up his flashlight. "I'll go check the box. Watch the perimeter." Walsh walked down the wooden steps, his heavy boots thudding loudly. He swept his beam across the lawn, completely missing the shadow pressed flat against the stone foundation. As Walsh rounded the corner toward the garage, he reached for the breaker box. A hand clamped over his mouth and nose, instantly cutting off his air supply. A forearm wrapped around his neck, applying precisely calibrated pressure to his carotid arteries. Walsh flailed, dropping his flashlight, his hands clawing uselessly at the steel band of muscle choking him. In 6 seconds, his eyes rolled back, and he went limp. David lowered the unconscious deputy to the grass, securing his wrists and ankles with heavy-duty zip ties, and placed a piece of duct tape over his mouth. One down. Back on the porch, Carter was growing impatient. "Walsh, you trip in the dark, you idiot!" Carter stepped off the porch, clicking off the safety of his rifle, a sudden prickle of unease raising the hairs on the back of his neck. He moved toward the corner of the house. He never saw David drop from the porch roof above him. David landed behind Carter, immediately stripping the rifle from the deputy's grasp with his left hand, while his right hand drove a palm strike into the brachial plexus nerve cluster on the side of Carter's neck. Carter collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, entirely paralyzed but terrifyingly conscious. David zip-tied him next to Walsh, leaning close to Carter's ear. "Blink if you understand that if you make a sound, I will put you in a coma." Carter, his eyes wide with absolute, primal terror, blinked furiously. The perimeter secure, David picked the heavy deadbolt on the back door and entered the lodge. The interior smelled of expensive leather, stale bourbon, and cigar smoke. He moved methodically, clearing rooms until he reached the master study. Toby's intel was accurate. Under a heavy Persian rug, David found the circular steel lid of a floor safe. David pulled a small, specialized electronic device from his tactical pouch, an auto-dialer used by federal agencies to bypass older combination locks. He attached the magnetic base to the dial, turned it on, and let it work. 3 minutes later, the safe clicked, and the heavy bolt retracted. David pulled the door open. Inside were stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. But David ignored the cash. He reached for the back of the safe and pulled out 2 thick, leather-bound ledgers and a portable hard drive. He opened the first ledger and shone his red lens penlight on the pages. The scope of the operation was staggering. Cobb wasn't just stealing houses, he was laundering money for a massive synthetic opioid ring operating out of Atlanta. The developers buying the seized properties were frontmen for a cartel. Cobb was seizing the land, forcing out the black and low-income residents, and selling the properties to the cartel to build distribution warehouses, masquerading as commercial logistics hubs. And right there, circled in red ink on a county parcel map, stapled to the back page, was Martha Higgins's address. David photographed every single page with his secure satellite phone, uploading the files directly to a heavily encrypted cloud server he shared with a contact in the Department of Justice. Then, he put the physical ledgers and the hard drive into his backpack. He had the proof, but proving it in a courtroom would take months, and Cobb would likely flee or destroy evidence before the FBI could move in. David needed Cobb to panic. He needed the sheriff to make a catastrophic, public mistake. It was time to take the war to Clayton Cobb. Sheriff Clayton Cobb woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of his coffee maker beeping in his sprawling, heavily gated suburban home. He rolled out of his king-sized bed, feeling a dull ache in his knuckles from where he had struck the old woman the day before. He smiled grimly. It was a good ache, a reminder of his absolute control. He walked into his massive kitchen, tying his silk robe around his waist, and headed for the coffee pot. He stopped dead in his tracks. The blood drained from Cobb's face, leaving his flush, ruddy complexion a sickly shade of grey. Sitting perfectly centered on his pristine granite kitchen island was his prized possession, his grandfather's silver-plated Colt .45 revolver. Only, it wasn't a revolver anymore. It had been entirely field-stripped. The cylinder, the barrel, the springs and the grips were laid out in a flawless, chillingly neat row, and placed gently beneath the dismantled firing pin was a cheap, white paper napkin. Cobb approached it with trembling hands. On the center of the napkin was a single, dried, brown stain, a drop of spilled coffee. Cobb's breath caught in his throat. His home security system was state-of-the-art. His perimeter alarm was on. His gates were locked. His Doberman Pinscher was sleeping soundly on the living room rug, unharmed but completely oblivious. Someone had bypassed it all. Someone had stood in his kitchen while he slept, dismantled his weapon in total silence, and left a message tying it directly to the incident at Patsy's diner. "No," Cobb whispered, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "No, no, no." He scrambled for his cell phone on the counter and dialed the hunting lodge. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He dialed Carter's cell. Voicemail. He dialed Walsh's cell. Voicemail. Panic, a raw and unfamiliar emotion, clawed at Cobb's chest. He ran to his bedroom, threw on his uniform, grabbed his backup Glock from his nightstand, and sprinted to his squad car. He broke every speed limit getting to the lodge. When he pulled through the front gates, he slammed on the brakes, the cruiser skidding through the gravel. Carter and Walsh were still tied to the front porch pillars. They were awake, dehydrated, and looking like men who had seen the devil himself. Cobb jumped out of the car, sprinting up the steps and pulling out his pocket knife to cut their zip ties. "What happened? Who hit you? Was it the feds? Was it the Atlanta guys?" Carter slumped forward, rubbing his raw wrists, his voice a hoarse croak. "We didn't see anything, boss. 1 second the lights went out. The next, it was just a shadow. He took us apart like we were children. He didn't even use a gun." Cobb didn't wait to hear the rest. He shoved past them and ran into the lodge, leaving a trail of muddy boot prints. He reached the master study and fell to his knees, staring at the floor safe. The door was wide open. The cash was completely untouched. But the ledgers and the hard drive were gone. "God damn it!" Cobb roared, slamming his fist into the floorboards. The echo filled the empty house. He was ruined. If those ledgers went to the FBI, he wouldn't just go to federal prison. The Atlanta cartel would butcher him for exposing their logistics network. He had a very narrow window to fix this. But his mind was spinning. Who had the skills to do this? His mind raced back to the napkin. The diner. The old woman. Martha Higgins. Could she have complained to the state police? No. The state boys didn't operate like ghosts. This was military. This was specialized. Then a sick realization washed over him. He remembered the framed photographs Toby Henderson had mentioned years ago during a noise complaint. Martha's son. The one who joined the Navy. Cobb pulled out his phone and called his dispatcher. "Brenda, run a background check. Deep level, military records. Name is David Higgins. Mother is Martha Higgins on Elm Street. Send it to my secure terminal right now." 10 minutes later, Cobb sat at his desk in the precinct, staring at his computer monitor. The file Brenda had pulled was heavily redacted. Entire pages were blacked out by the Department of Defense. But what wasn't redacted was enough to stop Cobb's heart. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Silver Star, multiple combat deployments, expert in asymmetrical warfare, psychological operations, and close quarters combat. Cobb wasn't dealing with a pissed-off local. He was being hunted by an apex predator. "Sheriff?" Deputy Toby Henderson poked his head into the office, carrying a stack of paperwork. Toby's face was carefully blank, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Everything all right? You look pale." "Shut the door, Toby," Cobb said softly. Toby closed the door and stood at attention. "We have a situation," Cobb said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "We have a rogue military asset in Pine Ridge. He broke into the lodge last night and stole county evidence. He's trying to build a case against this department." "What do we do?" Toby asked, playing his part perfectly. Cobb stopped pacing. His eyes hardened, the panic morphing into cornered desperation. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and Cobb was ready to burn the whole town down to save himself. "He took the ledgers to protect his mother's house," Cobb muttered to himself, connecting the dots. "He wants to stop the development. If he has the files, he's probably waiting to hand them off to a federal contact. We can't let that happen." Cobb looked at Toby. "Gather the tactical team. I want helmets, body armor, and long guns. We are executing a no-knock raid on Martha Higgins's residence at 1400 hours. Anonymous tip of a hostage situation and heavily armed drug activity." Toby's blood ran cold. "Sheriff, it's broad daylight. She's a 72-year-old woman. The town will riot." "I don't care about the town," Cobb bellowed, spit flying from his lips. "This guy wants to play war? I'll show him what a war looks like. We hit the house, we tear it apart, we find the hard drive, and if David Higgins resists, he gets put down as a hostile combatant. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" "Yes, sir," Toby said, turning to leave. As soon as Toby stepped into the hallway, he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and typed a single, prearranged text message to a burner number. "Green light. They are coming to the house." Across town, sitting in the darkened living room of his mother's home, David Higgins watched his phone screen light up with Toby's message. Martha was safe. David had moved her to a trusted friend's house in the next county before dawn, packing her a bag and telling her not to turn on the news. Now David was completely alone in the house he grew up in. He walked over to the windows, pulling the heavy floral curtains shut. He rolled up the carpets, pushed the heavy oak furniture to form natural funnels and barricades, and systematically unscrewed every light bulb in the house except for one in the central hallway. He wasn't preparing a defense. He was building a web. David checked the action on his Sig Sauer P226, though he had no intention of firing a lethal shot unless his life was in immediate, unavoidable danger. He checked his flex cuffs. He checked his flashbangs. Sheriff Cobb thought he was sending a tactical team to conduct a raid. He didn't realize he was sending his men into a fatal funnel, orchestrated by a man who had survived the most brutal sieges of the modern era. David sat in the shadows of the kitchen, perfectly still, slowing his breathing. He listened to the distant hum of the highway, waiting for the wail of the sirens. The storm was about to break over Pine Ridge, and David was the lightning. At precisely 2 p.m., the quiet, sun-baked piece of Elm Street was shattered by the roar of heavy V8 engines. 4 county sheriffs' SUVs, tires screeching against the asphalt, formed a jagged barricade across Martha Higgins's front lawn. 10 deputies piled out, clad in heavy olive-drab tactical vests, Kevlar helmets, and carrying AR-15 rifles. At the center of the formation was Sheriff Clayton Cobb, his face a mask of sweating, desperate rage. He pumped a 12-gauge shotgun, the metallic clack-clack echoing off the neighboring houses. Curtains in the adjacent homes fluttered as terrified neighbors peered out. They saw the armored men swarming the retired English teacher's house, and a collective, helpless dread washed over the block. "Stack up!" Cobb roared, pointing the barrel of his shotgun at the front door. "Breach and clear! If he breathes wrong, put him down." Carter, his neck still wrapped in a brace from the night before, hoisted a heavy steel battering ram. He swung it with all his remaining strength against the brass lock of Martha's front door. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and the door kicked open, swinging wildly on broken hinges. "Sheriff's Department, get on the ground!" Carter screamed, flooding into the hallway. Walsh and 3 other deputies filed in rapidly behind him, sweeping their rifle muzzles through the entryway. They expected the chaotic, panicked resistance of a cornered criminal. Instead, they stepped into a meticulously designed nightmare. The house was suffocatingly dark, the heavy curtains blocking the afternoon sun entirely. The only illumination came from a single, bare bulb hanging at the far end of the central hallway, creating a harsh, blinding glare that completely ruined their night-adjusted vision. And then, the single bulb popped. Total darkness swallowed them. Before Carter could reach for the flashlight mounted on his rifle, a cylindrical canister bounced off the doorframe and rolled directly between his boots. Bang! The stun grenade detonated with a blinding flash of magnesium light and a concussive shockwave of 170 decibels. The deputies in the hallway screamed, their inner ears violently disrupted, their vision reduced to blinding white spots. David moved from the shadows of the kitchen like a hunting panther. He wore tactical noise-cancelling headsets and dark-lensed ballistic glasses. To him, the chaos was a slow-motion ballet he had rehearsed 1,000 times. He didn't fire a single shot. He used the structure of the hallway against them. He grabbed the barrel of Walsh's rifle, violently jerking the deputy forward off his balance, and delivered a devastating knee to the man's solar plexus. Walsh folded in half, gasping for air that wouldn't come, before David swept his legs, sending him crashing into Carter in the narrow corridor. 2 other deputies, panicking in the smoke and ringing silence, squeezed their triggers, blowing holes in the ceiling plaster. David flowed past the gunfire. He grabbed the 3rd deputy by the tactical vest, using the man's own forward momentum to hurl him into the heavy oak barricade David had built from the dining table. The deputy hit the wood and slumped, unconscious. Within 30 seconds, the 5-man entry team was neutralized, disarmed, incapacitated, and groaning on the floorboards. David expertly kicked their weapons out of reach. Outside on the porch, Cobb heard the flashbang, the muffled shouts, and then a terrifying silence. "Carter! Walsh! Report!" Cobb screamed into his radio. Static hissed back at him. Sweat poured down Cobb's face. He signaled the remaining 4 men. "We push in. Now." They stepped over the shattered door frame. The smoke from the flashbang hung thick in the air. Cobb clicked his flashlight on, the beam cutting through the grey haze, illuminating the groaning bodies of his elite entry team scattered like broken toys. "Split up," Cobb whispered, his voice trembling. "Clear the rooms." The deputies crept into the living room and the kitchen. Cobb moved slowly down the main hallway, his shotgun raised, his finger white on the trigger. The silence of the house was absolute, heavy, and judgmental. "Higgins!" Cobb yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "It's over. I've got a perimeter. You're a dead man." "You're standing exactly where you slapped my mother," a voice said. It didn't come from in front of him. It came from directly above him. Before Cobb could tilt his shotgun upward, 220 pounds of hardened muscle dropped from the attic access panel in the ceiling. David landed squarely on Cobb's shoulders. The sheer kinetic force drove the massive sheriff, face first, into the hardwood floor. The shotgun flew from Cobb's hands, clattering uselessly down the hall. Cobb gasped, trying to push himself up, but a knee pressed into his spine with the weight of a freight train. A cold, steel barrel pressed gently against the back of his neck. "Don't move," David whispered. It wasn't an order. It was a physical law of the universe. In the living room, The remaining deputies spun around at the noise. But before they could even aim their weapons, the front windows exploded inward. Not from David, from the outside. FBI, drop your weapons. Drop the weapons now. Red laser sights cut through the smoke, painting the chests of the remaining county deputies. A dozen federal agents in heavy tactical gear, armed with submachine guns, flooded through the broken windows and the front door. Behind them, unmarked black vans had completely surrounded Cobb's cruisers. David's contact at the Department of Justice hadn't just received the ledgers, he had acted on them with federal jurisdiction. Deputy Toby Henderson, standing by the cruisers on the lawn, immediately dropped his rifle and put his hands on his head, a relieved, tearful smile breaking across his face. Inside, the federal agents swarmed the house, securing the remaining deputies. An older, grey-haired FBI special agent in charge walked down the hallway, stepping carefully over the debris. He looked down at David, who still had his knee on Cobb's back. "Senior Chief Higgins?" the FBI agent asked calmly. "Agent Miller," David replied, keeping his eyes on the back of Cobb's head. "I believe this belongs to you." David stood up, stepping back, allowing two federal agents to haul Sheriff Clayton Cobb to his feet. Cobb was bleeding from the nose, his uniform torn, his face pale with absolute defeat. "You're making a mistake," Cobb spat at the FBI agent. "I'm the law in this county. I have friends in the state capital. I'll have your badge for this." Agent Miller pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Clayton Cobb, you are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. While you were busy playing soldier here, the DEA just raided the Atlanta logistics hub, and your developer friends flipped on you in about 10 seconds. Cobb's eyes went wide, the final shred of his arrogance evaporating. He looked at David. The Navy SEAL stood in the shadows, his face an impenetrable mask of calm. "You planned this," Cobb whispered, his voice hollow. "You set me up to leave the precinct so they could move in." "I told you," David said softly. "I was going to dismantle your life." The arrest of Sheriff Clayton Cobb sent shockwaves through the state. But in Pine Ridge, it brought an exhalation of breath the town had been holding for decades. Within 48 hours, the corrupt deputies were suspended, pending federal indictment. The seized properties, including the titles to the East Side homes, were frozen by the DOJ, set to be returned to their rightful owners. The cartel's pipeline through the county was permanently severed. 3 days later, Patsy's diner was packed. The morning sun was shining, the coffee was brewing, and the low, easy murmur of the town was alive with genuine, unburdened laughter. The bell above the door chimed. The diner went quiet. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. Martha Higgins walked in. The bruising on her face had faded to a dull yellow, but she stood tall, wearing a bright floral dress, her silver hair perfectly pinned. Beside her walked David, dressed in a simple grey t-shirt and jeans, carrying his mother's purse. The entire diner stood up. It started with a slow clap from the back booth, and within seconds the room erupted into a standing ovation. People cheered, wiping tears from their eyes. Men who had looked away in shame days earlier now stepped forward to shake David's hand and pull Martha into tight, apologetic embraces. Patsy came out from behind the counter, sobbing openly, and wrapped her arms around Martha. "Welcome back, honey. Your booth is waiting." Martha smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She squeezed Patsy's hand and walked to her usual table. David slid into the booth across from her. "You see, Mom," David said, reaching across the Formica table to hold her weathered hand. "There's still good in this town. You just had to clear out the rot so the light could get in." Martha looked out the window. Across the street, Deputy Toby Henderson, now acting interim sheriff, endorsed by the state police to clean up the department, was helping an elderly man cross the intersection. She looked back at her son, the warrior who had brought the full might of his devotion to her doorstep. "I see it, David." She smiled softly. "I finally see it. If you loved this incredible story of justice, family, and standing up to corruption, hit that like button right now. Stories like Martha and David's remind us that bullies never win when the truth fights back. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never